I was 30 feet above the deck when the crane's camera feed froze on something that wasn't supposed to have a shadow at that angle. I remember thinking it was just salt on the lens, because admitting anything else would have meant logging the anomaly, and logging meant paperwork, and paperwork meant questions. By the time the feed corrected itself, my hands were shaking, and I couldn't remember how long I'd been holding the control lever still. That's when I thought about the binder again. The one with the 11 strange rules I was told were for safety, not survival. I'd laughed when I signed it. I don't laugh anymore, especially when the hook starts moving on its own. The binder came back to me, while the crane hook drifted, slow and patient, as if it had all the time in the world, and I didn't. I remembered the wording because it was awkward, almost embarrassed of itself, and the memory surfaced with the clarity that only mistakes seem to get. Rule 1. Never acknowledge a load that registers less than 0 was printed in the same dull ink as the rest, and I'd read it aloud once, half joking, half tired, asking the safety officer what kind of math needed a rule like that. He didn't answer me then, and standing there now, watching the numbers glow wrong on my console, I realized that silence had been the real explanation. I checked the gauges again, because that's what you do when reality slips a little. You look for the version that lets you keep working. The weight display hovered just below 0, not flickering, not drifting, just settled like it belonged there, and my first instinct was to reach for the logbook. That instinct died when I noticed the hook had stopped swaying, not from balance but from stillness, the kind that feels intentional. Down on the deck, 2 crewmen were arguing about coffee, their voices thin through the glass, and neither of them looked up, which made the space between me and the ocean feel wider than it ever had before. I told myself it was a calibration error, the kind that happens when salt creeps into places it shouldn't, and I ran the diagnostic with hands that felt heavier than usual. The system came back clean, too clean, like it wanted credit for something it hadn't done, and that's when I felt the pressure behind my eyes start to build. I remembered another line from orientation, someone joking that the rig had moods, and I'd laughed because machines don't get moods. People do. But as the hook lowered another inch without my input, I started to understand why nobody had laughed back. There's a camera mounted under the boom, angled to give operators a sense of depth when the water goes dark, and I hesitated before switching it on. The hesitation wasn't fear at first, it was etiquette. The same way you hesitate before opening a door, you know someone's behind. When the feed filled the screen, the water looked wrong, not murky or black, just folded in on itself, like distance had been bent. I caught myself leaning closer, squinting for detail, and had to force myself to sit back, because something about looking too hard felt like a kind of acknowledgement. A voice crackled through the intercom then, the rig supervisor asking why my cycle time had stalled, his tone already edged with irritation. I answered him carefully, choosing words that stayed on the surface of things, saying I was running checks, that the system needed a moment. He sighed and told me not to overthink it, reminding me that delays cost money, and money kept us all employed, and I almost told him about the numbers. The almost mattered more than the silence that followed, because in that pause I felt the sense that whatever was below the hook was listening for that confession. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, toggling switches that changed nothing, pretending to review charts I knew by heart, because stillness had started to feel like a decision. The hook began to descend again, smooth and controlled, as if someone else had taken the controls, and I had to grip the armrest to remind myself where I was. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, eyes too focused, mouth set in a way that suggested I'd already agreed to something. I thought about the rule again, not the words this time, but the intent, and realized it wasn't about safety so much as restraint. Below, the water shifted, not with waves but with something like anticipation, and the camera feed showed the faintest interruption in the uniform dark, a suggestion rather than a shape. I felt a pull then, not physical, more like curiosity sharpened into a hook of its own, urging me to name what I was seeing, to give it weight by giving it language. That urge scared me more than the anomaly itself, because it felt practiced, like it had worked on others before. I turned the camera off and stared at the blank screen, letting the after image burn itself out. The supervisor called again, his voice tighter now, asking if I'd fallen asleep up there, and I snapped back a reply that was sharper than I meant it to be. He told me to finish the cycle and bring the hook back up empty if I had to, and the word empty echoed in my head in a way that made my stomach knot. I realized then that empty was a kind of acknowledgement too, a statement about absence that could still be heard. So I did nothing, held the controls steady, and waited, counting my breaths and pretending the numbers weren't there. Time stretched in a way that made minutes feel negotiable, and in that stretched space, I noticed small things I'd never paid attention to before, like the way the rig's lights reflected off the water in uneven patterns. The hook stopped descending on its own, hovering just above where the camera had hinted at something different, and I felt a release of pressure that left me dizzy. Nothing dramatic happened, no sudden revelation or disaster, just a sense that a line had been drawn and not crossed. As I finally eased the hook back up, the weight indicator returned to 0, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was less a correction than a concession. I thought the worst part was over, when the weight settled back to 0, but the calm that followed felt borrowed, like I'd spent something I didn't own yet. As the hook rose dripping from the ocean, I remembered reading Rule 2, never look directly beneath the hook once it clears the waterline, a line I'd dismissed because it sounded theatrical, like it belonged in a safety video nobody watched. The memory surfaced without effort, sliding into place as the crane arm groaned and the cable tightened, and I understood then that the rule wasn't about what you might see, it was about what might notice that you'd looked. I kept my eyes fixed on the control panel as the hook broke the surface, watching numbers and indicators, instead of the live feed I'd relied on for years. The water cascading off the metal made patterns across the deck below, shadows stretching and collapsing as the rig lights caught them at odd angles. I could feel the urge to glance down, a physical pull behind my eyes, as if curiosity had weight now too. My neck muscles tensed, and I realized how automatic looking had always been, how much effort it took not to. The radio buzzed again, another operator asking why the deck was still clear, his voice carrying that mix of boredom and impatience that comes from long shifts and short tempers. I answered with half-truths, saying I was resetting after a sensor fault, leaving out the part where the fault felt intentional. He muttered something about night crews being cursed and switched channels, and the isolation that followed felt heavier than before. Alone up there, with the hook rising and my gaze locked forward, I felt like the rig itself was waiting to see if I'd break etiquette. As the hook climbed higher, the smell of salt and oil mixed into something sharper, almost metallic, and it caught at the back of my throat. I focused on my breathing, counting slow inhales the way I'd been taught during emergency drills. Though this wasn't an emergency anyone had trained for, the absence of sound from below felt wrong, not quiet but expectant, like a room full of people holding their breath. I wondered how many others had stood where I was, fighting the same urge, and whether they'd managed to keep their eyes forward. A memory surfaced then, uninvited, of an old operator who'd retired suddenly without saying goodbye. People said he'd cracked under the hours, that the isolation got to him, but I remembered the way he'd avoided eye contact during his last week, staring at walls and floors like they held answers. At the time I'd thought it was age or fatigue, something explainable and distant. Now, with the hook nearing its resting height, I felt a thread connecting his silence to mine, a lineage of restraint passed down without ceremony. The crane shuddered slightly as the hook cleared the water completely, droplets falling in slow arcs that seemed to hang longer than they should. My peripheral vision caught movement below, not a shape exactly, more like a distortion where reflections didn't line up. I tightened my grip on the controls, knuckles whitening, and stared harder at the panel, reciting the names of gauges under my breath to anchor myself. The temptation to confirm what I was sensing pressed in from all sides, and resisting it felt like holding a door shut against a crowd. Someone laughed over the radio on a different channel, a sudden burst of normalcy that almost made me turn in relief. The laugh cut off abruptly, replaced by static and a muffled curse, and the silence that followed felt pointed. I imagined eyes below the deck, not watching me directly, but aware of my presence in the way you're aware of someone standing just behind you. The idea made my skin prickle, and I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the sensation without moving my head. As the hook reached its resting position, the crane's systems chimed softly, signaling the end of the cycle. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, relief washing through me in a wave that left my limbs weak. For a moment I thought I'd done it, that following the rule had been enough to keep whatever was below at a distance. That thought lasted until I noticed the reflection in the control room glass, a warped double image that suggested my eyes had moved without my permission. I replayed the moment in my head, trying to pinpoint when I'd lost control, but memory felt unreliable, smudged at the edges. Had I glanced down, even for a fraction of a second, or was the guilt just another symptom of the pressure building inside me? The uncertainty gnawed at me, worse than any clear mistake would have been. If I couldn't trust my own recollection, then the rules weren't just about behavior, they were about belief, about policing your own thoughts. The supervisor's voice came through again, calmer now, telling me to log the completed cycle and prepare for the next load. I acknowledged him automatically, fingers moving through the motions while my mind lagged behind. Logging meant recording that nothing unusual had happened, a small lie layered over a larger one, and I felt a twinge of resentment at being complicit. Yet even as the resentment flared, I understood that acknowledging anything else would mean looking, and looking felt like an invitation. When I finally stood up to stretch, my legs trembled, the delayed reaction of adrenaline draining away. I kept my gaze level as I moved around the control room, avoiding windows and reflective surfaces like they might betray me. Outside, the rig continued its routine, lights blinking and machinery humming in practiced rhythms, indifferent to my internal calculus. The world hadn't ended because I'd followed the rule, but the sense of being observed lingered, unresolved, like a question that didn't need an answer to be dangerous. I sat back down and rested my hands on the controls, feeling the faint vibration of the crane through the metal. The next load request blinked onto the screen, mundane and expected, and for a heartbeat I considered calling in sick, walking away before the night demanded more from me. Instead, I accepted the task, telling myself that adherence was a form of safety, that discipline could substitute for understanding. As the crane arm began to move again, a subtle shift in the shadows below made my stomach drop, and I knew that whatever I'd avoided seeing was still there, waiting for another chance. The third rule surfaced without warning. As the boom began its slow rotation before I'd touched anything, a motion so smooth it took me a second to realize I wasn't responsible for it. I remembered reading Rule 3. If the crane moves when your hands are off the controls, do not stop it, tucked between equipment specs and emergency numbers, and feeling annoyed at how passive it sounded. Standing there now, palms hovering inches above the levers, I understood that the wording wasn't passive at all. It was instructional in the way you tell someone to lie still while something crawls over them, not to keep them calm, but to keep them intact. My first instinct was to grab the controls anyway, because that's what training drills into you, the idea that inaction is failure. The crane arm continued its arc toward the darker side of the rig, the side where lights thinned out, and the ocean swallowed reflections instead of giving them back. I watched the indicator lights flicker in patterns I didn't recognize, and my muscles twitched with the effort of staying still. Every part of me wanted to reassert authority, to prove that I was still the one making decisions, but the rule sat heavy in my chest, warning me that authority might be the wrong language here. The radio crackled with chatter from the deck crew, someone complaining about a loose cable near the aft section, another voice laughing it off. Their normalcy felt invasive, like background noise bleeding into a private moment, and I wondered how long it would take for them to notice the crane's unscheduled movement. The boom adjusted its angle by degrees too precise to be accidental, aligning itself over a stretch of water that hadn't been assigned any work that night. I kept my eyes on the movement, not beneath it, telling myself that observation wasn't the same as interference. As the crane reached its new position, the hook descended without command, cable unspooling in a controlled release that suggested intent rather than malfunction. I stepped back from the console, folding my hands together to keep them occupied, and felt a strange relief in surrendering control. There was guilt tangled up in that relief, a sense that by not acting I was complicit in whatever came next. The rule didn't offer justification or comfort, just a boundary, and I stayed on my side of it because crossing felt worse. A memory of a safety briefing flickered through my mind, an instructor saying that machines don't make mistakes, people do. At the time it had sounded like a platitude, but now it felt like an accusation aimed in the wrong direction. The crane's movement was deliberate, measured, as if following a plan I wasn't privy to, and that realization eroded something inside me. If the machine was acting with purpose, then my role shifted from operator to witness, and witnesses don't get to change outcomes. The hook continued its descent, passing the point where the water swallowed it from view, and I felt the urge to check the weight indicator rise again. I didn't, remembering how numbers had betrayed me before, and instead focused on the physical sensations around me, the vibration through the floor, the faint pressure change in my ears. Time seemed to stretch, not slowing exactly, but thickening, each second carrying more weight than it should. I wondered if this was how it started for others, the gradual recalibration of perception, until the abnormal felt routine. Someone knocked on the control room door, a sharp sound that made me flinch despite myself. Through the glass, I saw one of the deck supervisors, his brow furrowed as he gestured toward the crane arm, clearly expecting an explanation. I opened the door a crack and told him the system was running an automated correction, a phrase I'd heard used before to smooth over delays. He frowned, but accepted it, distracted by a call on his radio, and moved on, leaving me alone again with a lie that felt heavier than the truth. The crane paused, hook suspended somewhere below, and for a moment I thought the movement had finished on its own terms. That hope evaporated when the boom adjusted again, angling further out than safety margins recommended, stretching the cable toward a depth that made my stomach tighten. I felt sweat bead along my spine, the delayed response of fear finally catching up with me. Still, I didn't reach for the controls, because stopping it felt like an act of aggression, and I didn't know who or what would take that personally. Images intruded on my thoughts then, not clear pictures but impressions, like remembering a dream you're not sure you had. I thought of hands reaching up, not in panic, but in expectation, and the idea made my chest ache with an emotion I couldn't name. Was it anticipation, or dread, or something closer to recognition? The crane's steady motion seemed to answer that question in its own way. Indifferent to my internal struggle, the radio burst to life again. The supervisor's voice sharper now, asking why the crane was outside its assigned zone. I hesitated before responding, weighing my words carefully, aware that any attempt to override the movement would be noticed. I told him I was monitoring an anomaly and needed a few more minutes, leaning on the authority of caution to buy time. He cursed under his breath but agreed, and the permission felt hollow, like I'd just extended a leash instead of cutting it. As the hook reached its lowest point, the crane shuddered, not violently, but with a subtle tremor that traveled up the cable and into the boom. I gripped the edge of the console to steady myself, feeling the vibration resonate through my bones. Something about that tremor felt communicative, like a signal rather than a malfunction, and I fought the urge to interpret it further. Interpretation, I realized, was another form of interference, and ignorance had started to feel like a shield. The crane began to retract on its own, cable winding back up with the same controlled precision it had shown on the way down. Relief washed over me, followed closely by a sense of loss that caught me off guard. Whatever interaction had taken place below the surface was ending without my input, and part of me felt excluded, like a door closing on a conversation I hadn't known I was invited to. That feeling scared me more than the movement itself, because it hinted at a desire I didn't trust. When the hook cleared the waterline, I kept my gaze fixed forward, aware of how many rules were now layered inside my head, competing for attention. The crane returned to its neutral position and powered down, systems settling into their idle hum as if nothing unusual had occurred. I logged the cycle with hands that trembled despite my efforts to stay calm, recording data points that told an incomplete story. The omission felt deliberate, a choice I was making rather than a mistake, and that realization sat uneasily with me. I stayed in the control room long after the shift should have ended, listening to the rig's rhythms and replaying the sequence of events in my mind. The question that kept surfacing wasn't what had happened, but why the rule existed in the first place. Rules are written after incidents, not before, and that meant someone else had stood where I was now and made a different choice. As I finally shut down the console and prepared to leave, I noticed the crane arm twitch almost imperceptibly, like a muscle remembering a movement, and the unease that followed told me the night wasn't finished asking things of me. I caught myself reaching for the hook once, a fraction of a second too fast, and the memory of Rule 4, never touch the hook with anything other than the designated controls, slammed into me, like a warning I'd ignored before. The controls were cold beneath my fingers, precise and indifferent, and the steel cable swayed gently above the water, as if aware that I'd even thought about interfering. My palms itched to test the weight, to correct its subtle drift, but I froze, counting my breaths, reminding myself that curiosity was the bait, and the hook had teeth I couldn't see. The ocean below seemed to pulse in time, with the tension in the crane, and for a moment the rig felt less like a workplace, and more like a cage designed for watching mistakes. The deck looked distant from my perch, a checkerboard of muted colors and muted voices, each worker unaware of the calculus playing out above them. I imagined what would happen if I violated Rule 4, not in terms of immediate harm, but in the way the air would feel different, the lights bending in a way they didn't in compliance. That thought made my stomach churn, and my fingers tighten around the console's edge. I couldn't allow myself to entertain a test, couldn't rationalize the urge to touch as anything other than reckless, because the rules weren't suggestions, they were measurements of survival, and every transgression carried consequences I couldn't yet name. Movement in the water below caught my attention, a shadow too deliberate to be casual, and I had to clamp my eyes shut for a moment, reminding myself to stay on my side of the rule. The hook twitched as if it knew I'd looked, responding to my gaze without input, a subtle reminder of agency that wasn't mine. My heartbeat thudded in rhythm with its sway, uneven and unpredictable, like the ocean itself was breathing around me. I felt tension radiate from the crane arm down to the deck below, a line of pressure I couldn't trace fully, but could sense everywhere at once. I thought about old maintenance logs I'd read in quiet moments, pages filled with errors and near misses, small warnings that were never attributed to human hands. Those errors seemed trivial then, random, but now they felt like messages I had to interpret correctly to stay safe. The crane's subtle quivers mirrored what I remembered from those incidents, an invisible thread connecting me to operators who had made mistakes before me. I swallowed against the rising bile of realization, understanding that Rule 4 was less about the machine than about the consequences of impulsive thought, a test of restraint rather than skill. The intercom buzzed, breaking my focus, a reminder that the world above the waterline still demanded obedience to schedules and procedures. A deckhand's voice reported a snagged line, distant but precise, unaware that I was grappling with questions no one could answer. I responded automatically, carefully choosing words that didn't reveal panic, and tried to ignore the pull in my chest that wanted to correct the hook's trajectory manually. It wasn't instinctive skill I was practicing. It was self-preservation in a theater that measured hesitation as carefully as it measured action. Time distorted as I stayed still, the hook hovering like a pendulum over the water's surface, casting elongated reflections that seemed almost alive. Every shift of light on the cable suggested something beneath it, not visible but intimately aware, waiting for acknowledgement. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, the kind that accompanies ethical tests stretched to their limits. One wrong move, even the smallest touch outside the proper channels, could ripple across the rig in ways I couldn't predict. The rule weighed heavier with each passing second, a quiet insistence I couldn't escape. My mind wandered to a scenario I could not allow to exist. Touching the hook, feeling the cable under my palm, and what that might awaken below. The image made my throat constrict, my hands clenched tighter, and my fingers ached to release the anxiety into meaningless action. I realized that the crane wasn't a machine in this moment. It was a measure, a mirror, a device, meant to test my compliance to something larger than protocol. Even the wind seemed cautious, not moving the water in waves, but in small deliberate undulations that mirrored the hook's hesitation. I remembered the first day I read the binder, skimming through Rule 4 like it was a formality I'd never understand until now. It had seemed arbitrary, overcautious, maybe even redundant, and I'd laughed quietly at the thought of someone actually touching the hook improperly. Now that laughter was gone, leaving a cold knot of comprehension, the rule wasn't about what I could see or do, it was about what I couldn't measure, about restraint, in the presence of forces that didn't announce themselves politely. The ocean and the rig together were waiting, silent and exacting, for evidence of disobedience. Even the air felt heavier now, thick with salt and oil, and every breath I took reminded me of why the rule existed. The hook dipped slightly, responding to currents I couldn't see, and the temptation to reach out flickered briefly like a candle struggling against wind. I fought the impulse, acknowledging it internally without giving it life, and told myself that rules were only effective if followed consciously, not assumed. I leaned back slightly, allowing the crane's motion to become background again, but I didn't relax, because awareness was as crucial as restraint. As the cycle continued, shadows on the deck shifted, caught in a light that didn't match any fixture I knew, and I had to resist looking. My fingers hovered above the control levers, itching for tactile reassurance, yet I didn't move. Even thinking about touching the hook in any other way felt like opening a door to consequences that had already been set in motion. My muscles ached from tension, my vision sharpened from forced concentration, and every sense screamed that something unseen was monitoring compliance. Finally, the crane completed its rotation, and the hook rested just above the waterline, dripping and glinting under the rig's lights. I exhaled slowly, aware that nothing had happened, yet feeling that the absence of incident was a warning rather than a reprieve. I sat in silence, listening to the subtle vibrations through the metal floor, and felt a faint shift in the tension, a quiet acknowledgement that the rules weren't arbitrary but exacting. I would not touch the hook outside the designated controls, not now, not ever, but the unease lingered, a presence that suggested observation didn't end with obedience. The hum of machinery filled the control room as I finally allowed my hands to rest fully on the console. The hook's weight indicator showed steady numbers, nothing unusual, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the crane's stillness was watching, remembering and judging. I replayed every step I'd taken, each hesitation and each choice not to interfere, understanding that Rule 4 had been less a guideline and more a boundary drawn between me and the unknown below. The reflection of the crane in the control room glass shimmered oddly, as if the metal itself remembered my restraint, and I realized the night wasn't done teaching yet. The fifth rule came back to me, when droplets began sliding off the hook, even though the log clearly showed it had never been lowered far enough to touch the sea. I remembered the line exactly because it had sounded almost sarcastic when I first read it, and standing there, I could hear my own younger voice mocking it in my head. Rule 5. If the hook returns wet after a dry cycle, do not ask where the water came from, sat heavy in my thoughts as the moisture gathered on the metal, dripping onto the deck in a steady rhythm that didn't match any motion I'd made. The water looked darker than seawater should under those lights, thicker somehow, and I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with guilt. I stared at the cycle log again, scrolling back through timestamps, elevations, depth limits, trying to prove to myself that I wasn't misremembering. The numbers were clean, precise, obedient, and that made the wetness worse, not better. I wiped my hands on my coveralls, even though I hadn't touched anything, a reflexive attempt to distance myself from contamination that might not be physical at all. Below me, the deck crew slowed, some of them glancing up at the hook with puzzled expressions, and I felt a sharp urge to explain myself, even though no accusation had been made. One of the deckhands keyed his radio and asked if we'd taken on spray from a rogue swell, his tone casual but curious. I told him no, keeping my voice steady, and watched as he crouched to touch the pooled water with his glove before thinking better of it. That moment lodged itself in my stomach like a stone, because the rule wasn't just about me asking questions, it was about preventing them from spreading. Silence, I was starting to understand, was a form of containment. The smell reached me next, faint but unmistakably wrong, not the sharp tang of salt, but something flatter, like rain that had fallen through machinery. I leaned back in my chair, increasing the distance between myself and the window, and focused on the sensation of the seat beneath me, grounding myself in textures I trusted. The water continued to fall, each drop landing with a patience that suggested it would outlast my attention. I wondered how long it would take before someone decided this was a maintenance issue instead of an anomaly. My mind kept circling the phrasing of the rule, especially the word ask, and I realized how narrow it was. It didn't say don't investigate or don't clean it up, just don't ask where it came from, as if the act of questioning carried its own risk. That idea made me uneasy in a way that felt personal, because I'd always believed understanding was a kind of safety. Here, understanding felt like exposure, like standing too close to an open hatch without knowing what was below. The supervisor came up to the control room not long after, his boots leaving damp prints that he didn't seem to notice. He asked me if the hook had dipped lower than scheduled, and I shook my head, showing him the logs without commentary. He frowned, rubbed his chin, and said we'd file a maintenance ticket, his focus already drifting to the inconvenience rather than the impossibility. I watched him leave, relieved and unsettled by how easily the moment passed without deeper scrutiny. As the water finally slowed and stopped, the hook gleamed under the lights, clean and innocent looking again. I expected relief, but what I felt instead was a hollow anticipation, like the end of a conversation that hadn't finished saying what it needed to. The deck crew mopped up the puddles, joking about leaky skies and faulty equipment, and I forced myself to smile when one of them looked up at me for reassurance. My jaw ached from holding that expression longer than felt natural. Alone again, I replayed the sequence in my head, not to analyze it but to mark it, the way you remember landmarks when you know you might need them later. The hook's wetness felt less like an event, and more like a message delivered without words, one that I was expected to receive without response. I thought about how many rules were built around omission rather than action, and how exhausting it was becoming to measure my behavior against absences. Doing nothing, saying nothing, thinking nothing felt like a full-time job. The next cycle request blinked onto my screen, routine and mundane, and my hands hesitated over the controls. For a moment I considered calling attention to the earlier anomaly, documenting it properly, letting procedure handle it. The idea faded as quickly as it came, replaced by a deeper understanding that procedure wasn't designed for this kind of discrepancy. I accepted the request and initiated the cycle, my movements careful, deliberate, and heavy with restraint. As the crane arm moved, I noticed faint streaks along the cable where moisture had dried unevenly, leaving patterns that didn't align with gravity. I told myself it was residue, harmless and explainable, and refused to follow the thought further. The ocean below looked calm, deceptively ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like camouflage rather than comfort. I kept my focus narrow, on angles and speeds and limits, shrinking my world to the size of the console. By the time the cycle ended, my shoulders were tight with fatigue, a dull ache settling in that felt older than the night itself. Nothing else unusual happened, and yet I couldn't shake the sense that something had been exchanged without my consent. The hook rested in its cradle, dry now, as if the water had never been there at all. That erasure disturbed me more than the wetness had, because it suggested a choice had been made to leave no evidence behind. I logged the cycle and sat back, staring at the dark glass of the window, my reflection faint and distorted. The rig hummed around me, steady and familiar, and for a moment I almost believed I could return to seeing it as just a workplace. Then I noticed a single droplet sliding down the inside of the glass, slow and deliberate, and I looked away before my mind could form the question the rule forbade. I froze when the alarm lights flickered briefly, a subtle pulse that the monitors told me was nothing serious, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I remembered Rule 6, never override the automated safety systems, even if they seem wrong, and the memory hit like a warning etched into my muscle memory. Not just a line on paper. The override panel glowed faintly beside me, tempting with a promise of control, the kind that's always there when fear presses in. My fingers itched to press a button, to correct what my senses insisted was an error, but the rule anchored me in place, reminding me that any interference could have consequences far beyond immediate comprehension. The crane's sensors displayed a slight tension in the cable, a reading that wasn't catastrophic but abnormal enough to make the heart rate climb. I measured the situation in fractions of degrees and pounds, analyzing instead of acting, because acting would mean overriding. The hum of the rig filled the control room, mechanical and insistent, and I realized that every vibration, every imperfection, became magnified when you considered breaking the rule. It wasn't fear of punishment. It was the sense that the systems themselves were alive in some practical sense, and meddling would be disrespectful in a way I couldn't define. A sudden movement outside caught my attention, a rope flailing slightly against the deck railing, as if testing its own limits. I knew my mind wanted to correlate this to the crane's readings, to justify manual intervention, but the rule pressed against that urge like a physical force, reminding me that some alignments aren't meant to be changed by human hands. I breathed slowly, counting each inhale and exhale, feeling the tiniest pulse of doubt creep in, the kind that comes from knowing an option exists, but choosing restraint. The intercom crackled, the supervisor checking in again, casual but watchful, asking if everything was proceeding normally. I gave the standard reply, careful not to imply concern, and listened as he moved on, unaware that the machines were already communicating with me in a language I barely recognized. Every system that beeped or pulsed felt like it carried intent, and I fought to remind myself that intention didn't equal malevolence. Even so, the thought of pressing override made my skin crawl. It was more than mechanical interference. It felt like transgression. Outside the window, shadows shifted across the rig's deck, distorted and oddly synchronized with the crane's movement. I told myself repeatedly that observing wasn't interfering, that my eyes were a passive measurement tool, yet the urge to correct those distortions remained. The cable swayed with a rhythm that seemed impossible for natural wind or tide to create, and I realized that if I acted against the system, I might break the delicate balance the rules demanded. Compliance felt like endurance, like holding a breath while the world waits for you to act recklessly. A memory surfaced of an older operator, recounting his early days on the rig, speaking in hushed tones about moments where someone ignored a system warning just to see, and the consequences were never pleasant. I remembered laughing then, thinking it was a cautionary tale, but now the story resonated with the weight of inevitability. The lesson wasn't punishment, it was preservation. And Rule 6 had the subtlety of a command etched into muscle, not a suggestion. Every instinct I had wanted to press forward, yet restraint became its own skill, sharp and exhausting. The crane moved slowly on its own, automated precisely, but the sway of the hook suggested more than physics, as if some invisible current threaded through the cable and beyond. I gritted my teeth and reminded myself of the rule, a mantra more than a sentence now, repeating it mentally to stave off the itch of control. The monitors flickered again, showing minute anomalies that invited action, but I remained still, resisting the temptation to intervene. Each second stretched, elasticity making the smallest decisions feel monumental. The intercom buzzed again, the voice checking load weights on the deck, mundane inquiries that contrasted sharply with the strangeness of the crane's autonomous movements. I answered calmly, monitoring the cable's tension, while mentally rehearsing the sequence of events that could unfold if I ignored the rule. The anticipation of potential disaster lingered at the edge of perception, a quiet anxiety that didn't need articulation. Even in stillness, the crane demanded attention, and the rule acted as both leash and guide, restraining what my hands wanted to do instinctively. I noticed reflections in the control room glass, patterns that shifted unnaturally as the boom moved, and I reminded myself that interpretation was the danger, not observation. The line between seeing and acting blurred, each movement of the crane suggesting options I could never take. My fingers hovered above the override panel, a test of self-control more than anything else, and I shivered at the awareness that a single press could undo the fragile order I was clinging to. Rule compliance now felt like an endurance test, not a precaution. The hook reached its lowest automated point and began to rise again, tension in the cable subtly decreasing as it completed the cycle. I exhaled slowly, though part of me remained alert, feeling the invisible weight of consequences pressing just behind my eyes. Nothing catastrophic had happened, but the quiet victory of restraint was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. I leaned back, letting the vibration of the crane hum through the floor, realizing that adherence to the rule didn't just prevent harm. It kept me aware, alive, and tethered to the world in a way recklessness never could. The cycle ended with the hook resting slightly above the waterline, perfectly aligned, and I logged the completion with hands that trembled from tension, not exertion. The reflections on the console screens flickered again, a subtle reminder that the crane was still alive with activity I could barely perceive. I left the controls untouched, listening to the machinery's faint hum, aware that the night had taught me a lesson I might only understand later. Compliance, observation, and restraint were intertwined, and I understood that breaking Rule 6 would not just disrupt the crane, it might disrupt me entirely. I noticed it first when two sensors displayed slightly different weights for the same load. A variance so small, I almost dismissed it, but my stomach clenched anyway. I remembered Rule 7, never trust the readings from more than one sensor at a time, and a shiver ran through me because the warning wasn't about accuracy. It was about attention, about forcing me to commit to one reality and ignore the other. My eyes darted between the digital displays, each flickering with numbers that should have aligned, and I realized the discrepancy was deliberate, like a test I hadn't agreed to take. Choosing one sensor meant ignoring another, and ignoring anything when working above 100 feet over the waterline felt like signing a contract with consequences I couldn't predict. The crane moved slowly as I wrestled with the numbers, the hook swaying above the waves with a patience I found unsettling. I wanted to cross-check, to average the readings or calculate a compromise, but the rule stopped me cold. Compliance now wasn't just about staying safe. It was about sanity, about trusting one thread of truth when the rest of the world seemed to contradict itself. The faint vibration in the boom matched the tension coiling in my chest, a reminder that the crane wasn't just metal and hydraulics. It was a test of perception. Outside, the rig seemed calm, deckhands moving in familiar patterns, unaware that above them, I was being forced into a decision that felt almost philosophical. Choosing one sensor meant living with doubt about the other, and the air seemed heavier because of it. I leaned against the console, hands hovering above the controls, willing my mind to commit to a single reality. Every instinct screamed to reconcile the discrepancy, but the rule whispered insistently that I couldn't, that survival depended on restraint. The radio buzzed, voices of crew members reporting minor anomalies in unrelated machinery, laughter masking fatigue, and it felt almost cruel how normal life went on while I measured every number as if my existence depended on it, which in a way it did. I focused on the primary sensor, telling myself the other didn't exist, willing myself to feel certainty where none truly existed. The hook dipped slightly, as if testing my resolve, and I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to glance at the second readout. Ignoring the other number felt like obeying an unspoken presence that measured hesitation and uncertainty. Memories of previous operators filtered through my mind, tales of minor errors that snowballed into disasters, incidents blamed on misreading gauges or trusting conflicting data. At the time, I'd thought the stories cautionary exaggerations, teaching moments dressed as horror stories. Now, watching two seemingly contradictory truths on the display, I understood the lesson wasn't about error. It was about choice and obedience, about submitting to the rules even when they contradict instinct. Choosing wrongly, or doubting too long, felt like a mistake that couldn't be undone. The hook continued its pendulous sway, teasing shadows across the water, and my eyes focused on the numbers that had been designated as primary for this cycle. I ignored the secondary readout, even as it pulsed in my peripheral vision, insisting it was real. The vibration of the crane transmitted through my feet, the mechanical hum filling the space around me, reminding me of the weight of restraint. Every fraction of an inch, the hook moved required acknowledgement of the rule. Pick one, commit to it, and let the rest fade into oblivion. A memory intruded, of a supervisor telling me that sensors could fail, that redundancy existed to cover mistakes, but the lesson was incomplete. Redundancy was a trap when paired with this rule, because trusting two voices at once was the easiest way to be caught between realities. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to lean on one set of numbers, to treat the other as though it didn't exist. The tension didn't leave, it merely shifted, concentrated into a tight coil in my chest that reminded me how fragile certainty had become. As I guided the hook through its movements, the two readings danced in subtle disagreement, a quiet challenge to my focus. Each sway of the cable seemed exaggerated by my commitment to the primary sensor, a gentle tease meant to test my resolve. I felt the pull of curiosity, the desire to verify, and resisted it with effort that made my arms ache. The rule didn't require action. It required presence, observation, and discipline, and those qualities were as heavy as the hook suspended above the waves. The intercom crackled again, someone reporting a misalignment elsewhere on the rig, and I answered automatically, the words sliding from my mouth before my mind could process the irony. The discrepancy in the sensors was unrelated to their concern, but awareness of it made the normal exchanges feel intrusive. I shifted slightly, balancing my need to maintain posture with the knowledge that every movement of the hook and crane was being measured in subtle ways I couldn't articulate. Observing and obeying, I reminded myself, was survival in its most active form. Finally, the cycle ended with the hook resting precisely where the primary sensor indicated, tension stable, the secondary readout slightly askew. I exhaled slowly, letting the control room's quiet hum fill the space where anxiety had been coiled. The other sensor's numbers still blinked irregularly, a reminder that truth could be multiple things, but adherence to the rule had carried me through intact. Even as I logged the completion, a small part of me wanted to glance, to see if ignoring it had consequences, but the lingering unease reminded me why the rule existed, and why discipline sometimes felt heavier than danger. The hook now rested safely above the waterline, reflections scattering in odd patterns across the deck. I stayed seated for several minutes, hands on the console, letting the weight of observation settle through my body. My eyes flicked toward the secondary sensor once, as though daring myself, and I immediately looked away, heart hammering. The rig continued its quiet rhythm, and I understood that surviving Rule 7 wasn't about knowledge or skill, but about faith and restraint, and the absence of certainty was as much a burden as the hook itself. I noticed the red glow first, when the emergency panel flickered briefly, casting distorted shadows across the control room, and my stomach sank, despite knowing everything appeared normal. Rule 8. Never assume the emergency lights indicate a real malfunction echoed in my mind, and I understood immediately that it wasn't the illumination itself that mattered, but my reaction to it. I hesitated, fingers hovering above the switches, willing the impulse to test the circuits away. The lights pulsed again, faint and inconsistent, their rhythm almost conversational, teasing my instinct to respond as if they were communicating something I couldn't quite decipher. I glanced toward the deck and noticed crew members continuing their tasks, as though nothing had changed, unaware that I was caught in a calculus of perception and restraint. The hook hung still above the waterline, oblivious to my inner turmoil, and the hum of machinery filled the silence between pulsing lights. Each flicker seemed slightly different, almost deliberate, and I felt the first tight coil of unease form in my chest. I reminded myself that the rule existed because lights could be manipulated, that appearances could be designed to provoke panic or error. The temptation to override, to shut down the emergency system, and check for faults, pressed at the back of my mind, subtle but persistent. I resisted, reminding myself that the rule's purpose wasn't just safety. It was psychological, teaching operators to maintain judgment under illusions of threat. My hands clenched the edge of the console, knuckles white, as the light blinked again, almost in time with my heartbeat. Each pulse made me question my perception, the line between real and artificial blurrier than it had any right to be. A memory surfaced unbidden, of a retired operator, recounting a story of lights, triggering evacuations for no reason, the crew panicking and losing precious minutes. At the time, I'd nodded politely, dismissing it as a cautionary tale. Now, staring at the subtle flicker across the rig, I understood the lesson wasn't about technical failure. It was about restraint, about measuring response instead of instinct. Acting on impulse here could unravel everything, not because the lights were dangerous, but because my own reaction could become the hazard. The glow shifted, reflected against the control panels, elongating shadows of gauges and levers in impossible angles. I focused on breathing steadily, counting each exhale to ground myself in reality, while the lights danced in a rhythm that almost seemed sentient. Outside, waves splashed against the rig's supports, entirely mundane, yet the pulsing glow in the control room made each splash feel deliberate, calculated. I reminded myself of the rule again, letting it anchor me against the creeping sense that the environment wanted me to misinterpret, to panic, to intervene. Voices on the intercom broke my focus, deckhands reporting small incidents, ropes snagged loose fasteners, but none mentioned the lights. Their normalcy was maddening in contrast to the unnatural flicker, a reminder that only I was expected to measure the response correctly. My eyes flicked briefly to the emergency panel, counting intervals between pulses, my mind mapping patterns. I wasn't meant to decipher. The urge to react, to reach for the circuit breaker, rose and fell like a tide, but the rule held firm, demanding that I stay present yet inactive. The hook shifted slightly, responding to subtle wind currents, and I realized I was holding my breath almost unconsciously. Each shadow cast by the red glow seemed exaggerated, as if the lights themselves were amplifying minor irregularities into perceived threats. I told myself to trust the rule and trust my judgment, to acknowledge the tension but not respond to it as if it were real danger. Restraint was exhausting in this context, a constant balancing act between awareness and reaction, and my body ached from the effort. I considered for a fleeting moment logging the anomaly as a malfunction, marking it in the system for inspection, but the rule's wording stopped me cold. Documentation would be acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was exactly what the lights demanded I avoid. I leaned back slightly, trying to center myself on neutral controls, resisting the compulsion to fix, adjust, or even comment. Every second of compliance felt heavy, like a test I hadn't agreed to take, and yet I knew it was essential for survival, not just protocol. The red glow diminished, flickering slower as if tiring, and I felt a slight easing in the tight coil of my chest. But the relief was fragile. Even as the lights dimmed, I could feel an edge of anticipation, like the rule hadn't ended its lesson yet. My fingers rested lightly on the controls, muscles still tense, every nerve alert to patterns that weren't there. Observing without reacting felt almost unnatural, a discipline I had to enforce constantly to maintain a semblance of control. Finally, the emergency panel returned to normal illumination, the pulsing ceased, and the rig resumed its usual rhythm. I sat for a few long minutes, letting my body release the tension, replaying each flicker in my mind. The lights hadn't harmed me, yet the exercise had stripped my confidence in perception, forcing me to separate instinct from protocol. I realized that Rule 8 wasn't about machinery or alarms. It was about testing patience, testing restraint, and ensuring that survival depended on judgment rather than reflex. Even as the room quieted, a subtle unease lingered, reminding me that the rig's lessons were far from over. I shifted in my seat, trying to adjust the tension in my back, and immediately felt the weight of Rule 9. Never leave the controls unattended when the hook is in motion, even for a moment pressing down on me. The hook swayed slightly in rhythm with the waves, the motion deceptively slow but calculated, and I realized that even a single second of distraction could undo all the careful restraint I'd been practicing. I wanted to reach for my water bottle, to take a sip and relieve the dryness in my throat, but the rule anchored me firmly to the console. My eyes stayed locked on the gauges, following every subtle vibration in the crane, feeling a constant pressure that wasn't entirely physical. The deck looked quiet from above, ordinary and steady, yet the moment felt charged, as if something invisible lurked just beneath the surface. I kept my hands on the levers, not touching, but hovering, ready to respond without initiating. The crane's own mechanics hummed beneath me, vibrations running up through the floor and into my spine, and I became acutely aware of every fraction of movement. The hook traced arcs above the water, each one precise yet eerie, and I understood that leaving the controls unattended wasn't just dangerous, it was a violation of a silent contract with whatever presence measured compliance from below. A flicker in the corner of my eye drew my attention toward the secondary monitor, showing the hook's shadow distorted across the waterline. I resisted the urge to look too closely, telling myself that observation was fine, but action was forbidden. Every instinct screamed to adjust, to intervene, to ensure stability, but the rule reminded me that restraint was survival. One moment away, and I could become irrelevant, a puppet in a system I thought I controlled. The hum of hydraulics, the faint scent of oil and salt, the distant chatter of the crew, it all combined to sharpen my awareness, to make leaving the controls unthinkable. Time slowed as I sat, hands fixed, heart thudding unevenly against my ribs. Each slight sway of the hook became magnified in perception, a pendulum swinging just slightly off rhythm with the world. My mind tried to wander, thinking of coffee waiting in the mess hall, a call from home I might make later, or a small mundane task I could perform. Each thought tugged at the edges of discipline. I had to suppress all of them, repeating the rules silently, letting it anchor me to the task and the present, because even the smallest lapse could have consequences that wouldn't show themselves immediately. The intercom buzzed briefly, a crew member reporting minor deck activity, and I responded automatically, careful to keep my voice calm and controlled. I knew that any sign of distraction would be interpreted, even subconsciously, by the crane, or by whatever eyes might be observing through the rig and water. My hands hovered near the emergency stop, but I didn't touch it, resisting the dual pull of fear and curiosity. The hook continued to swing, each slight movement highlighting how vulnerable I would be if I ever left the console unattended. Shadows stretched and twisted across the control room, as the rig's lights reflected in angles I hadn't noticed before, giving depth to otherwise familiar surfaces. I became painfully aware of every muscle, every shift of weight, every reflex that might betray me into action. Even glancing away felt dangerous. The hook's pendulum motion seemed to echo my internal rhythm, a syncopation that made detachment impossible. I realized that remaining present, fully engaged, was as exhausting as it was necessary, and that the rule was more about psychological endurance than mechanical safety. A memory surfaced of an operator who had briefly left the console, trusting the automated systems, only to return to chaos he didn't understand. I recalled the panic in his voice, the way the crew scrambled, and I shivered at the thought. It had always been a cautionary tale, and now I experienced it firsthand, not as a story, but as an understanding of why absolute vigilance mattered. The rule didn't only protect against accidents, it protected against the erosion of certainty, of confidence in my own perception and judgment. The hook shifted again, a subtle sway that made the steel cable sing against the rig's supports. I could feel a tight knot of anticipation in my stomach, a warning that even minor deviation from attention might invite consequences. My eyes darted from gauge to hook to reflection, absorbing everything while acting on nothing. It was exhausting, almost maddening, but leaving the controls, even for a moment, was impossible. Every fraction of hesitation felt like opening a door I didn't want to pass through. Minutes stretched into an indistinct blur as I maintained my vigil. My hands loosened, tensed again, small adjustments made instinctively to account for micro vibrations in the system, but never leaving the controls. The rule wasn't about movement, it was about presence. I understood it fully now, that even the act of thinking about stepping away could count as a lapse. The crane, the rig, the water below, all were test and witness to compliance, and I felt their scrutiny even in stillness. By the end of the cycle, the hook rested just above the water line, motion ceasing almost imperceptibly. Relief washed over me, though I remained seated, fingers still lightly on the levers, eyes tracing every shadow and flicker. The rig hummed its routine rhythm, and I realized that Rule 9 had not been about the physical act of leaving the controls, but about maintaining presence, vigilance, and mental discipline in a world that could exploit a single lapse. Even after the movement stopped, the weight of the lesson lingered, a reminder that some rules measure the mind as much as they do the body. It happened almost immediately, a tool slipping from the deckhand's grasp and plunging toward the dark water below, and my stomach sank with the weight of Rule 10. Never attempt to retrieve anything that falls overboard, no matter how small or critical it seems. The metal glinted briefly in the rig lights, before disappearing into the black. A tiny object, but one that carried a disproportionate pull on my conscience. My first instinct was to act, to bend protocol, to lower the crane hook and fish it out. But the rule slammed into me like a wall. Every fiber of my training screamed to recover it, to assert control, but restraint was survival, not convenience. And I had to fight the urge with every ounce of focus. The waves below churned lazily, mocking the instinct to intervene. I could see no bottom, only darkness that seemed to thicken as my eyes lingered on the spot where the tool had vanished. Time slowed, each second stretching into a question I didn't want to answer. The crew on the deck looked puzzled, some murmuring complaints about wasted effort, but none of them knew the gravity of the moment. I gripped the console, willing my hands to stay still, feeling a tension coil in my shoulders that had nothing to do with fatigue. It was a psychological weight, pressing against my chest, reminding me that compliance often feels like betrayal. I thought back to past incidents, whispered stories of people who ignored this rule. Each tale ended in subtle but irrevocable consequences. Tools returned damaged beyond recognition, minor mistakes escalating into near disasters, some operators simply disappearing from reports, their absence noted in hushed tones. The lesson was clear. Intervention was not about the object itself, but about exposure. Attempting retrieval, even for something trivial, made the observer vulnerable. My mouth went dry, realizing the literal and figurative implications. The water was a threshold, and stepping across it without permission had consequences I couldn't yet quantify. The crane's hook remained in its suspended position, seemingly indifferent, but the sway of the cable mirrored the tug on my restraint. The object below was insignificant compared to what might be watching, and that was the part the rule didn't spell out. I told myself the tool was gone, that it didn't matter, and yet I could feel a pull, a subtle tug toward defiance, that my mind needed to resist. Observation alone had become almost unbearable, as if acknowledging loss could lead to disaster. I clenched my jaw, suppressing the impulse, counting breaths, willing my body to obey as the rule dictated. Outside, the rig hummed with mundane activity. Deckhands continued their duties, oblivious to the decision hanging in the balance above them. I considered the various ways the object could have ended up where it was. Current, wind, perhaps an unseen force, but the rule left no room for inquiry. To question the fall was to invite a chain of consequences I didn't understand. The water below was both boundary and test, and I realized that the act of leaving something lost was as much a skill as operating the crane itself. I reminded myself of previous cycles, times when minor errors had cascaded into serious incidents. The object's disappearance might seem trivial, but I understood that the rig had its own logic, one that operated outside conventional reasoning. The rule wasn't about the tangible, it was about the intangible cost of interference. I felt the crane vibrate slightly, as if sensing my internal debate, a subtle reminder that even the perception of action mattered. My fingers twitched, but remained poised above the levers, a silent battle between desire and discipline. The reflection of the rig's lights on the water shimmered oddly, distorting familiar shapes into patterns I couldn't interpret. I tried to focus on the hook, the cable, the console readings, anything to anchor myself in tangible reality, but the darkness below pulled at my attention insistently. I understood that looking too long, even without action, was dangerous. Acknowledgement alone could count as engagement. I shifted slightly, breathing deliberately, reinforcing the boundary between what I could control and what I could not. Minutes passed, the hook swaying minutely in rhythm, with subtle shifts of the wind. The tool had vanished entirely from sight, yet my mind replayed its descent endlessly. The rule's power lay in forcing me to witness loss without interference, and the lesson was exacting. Desire to act felt natural, almost irresistible, but the discipline to refrain became the measure of competence. Every fiber of my being resisted the pull to retrieve, yet obeying the rule required embracing that resistance fully. I checked the monitor again, ensuring that no automated systems would attempt recovery on my behalf. Nothing indicated movement, no alarms, nothing. Yet the unease lingered, a tight coil in my chest that refused to relax. The crane's mechanical hum seemed almost expectant, as though aware I had adhered to the rule despite temptation. The lesson had been delivered silently. Loss must remain absolute, and the observer must remain detached. By the time the cycle ended, the hook rested steadily above the waterline, and the deck returned to its routine. I exhaled slowly, though the tension remained, gnawing softly at the edges of awareness. The tool was gone, the rule observed, and I understood that the discipline had more to do with my own survival than with any tangible outcome. Obedience had preserved a fragile equilibrium, and the night continued, teaching that restraint was more powerful than intervention, and that some losses were designed to be absolute. By the time I realized I'd reached the 11th rule, exhaustion had already begun to blur the edges of my awareness. But Rule 11: never look directly at the water when the hook is suspended. What watches may not be human hit differently than the others. It wasn't mechanical or procedural. It was alive with warning, a subtle insistence that some boundaries were absolute. I had been trained to watch instruments, to interpret gauges and logs, yet the darkness beneath the hook felt sentient, aware of every fraction of movement, every tremor of hesitation. I forced my gaze away from the water, focusing instead on the console, the faint hum of machinery, the reflection of lights on metal, but even that felt insufficient. The hook hung like a pendulum over the black rhythmic waves, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the water. Every instinct urged me to look, to confirm the absence of threat, but the rule anchored my eyes elsewhere, insisting that absence could not be verified. I could feel it watching, an attention so subtle that I wasn't sure if it existed in the world or only in my mind. The reflection of my own face on the console glass looked warped, distorted, like the water was somehow projecting something that shouldn't exist, an impossible twin of awareness that mirrored my dread. My hands hovered above the levers, muscles aching from hours of rigid vigilance. I reminded myself that every prior rule had prepared me for this one, not with logic, but with endurance, self-restraint, and the discipline to survive without knowing. The hook shifted slightly, responding to currents I could barely sense, and I imagined what might be beneath, just beyond vision. The thought gnawed at me, impossible to ignore, yet forbidden. A tension that made every second stretch like hours. I could feel my heart pounding, not from immediate danger, but from the weight of compliance. The effort to respect a boundary whose violation might undo everything. The rig's lights reflected off the water at angles that didn't make sense, elongating shadows and creating impossible shapes. I had to remind myself that the rule wasn't about entertainment or curiosity. It was about restraint, about survival in a system that measured every twitch of attention. I could hear faint echoes from the deck, ordinary noises that somehow seemed amplified, carrying a rhythm that synced uncomfortably with the sway of the hook. My fingers itched to adjust the boom, to look directly, to see for myself, but I fought the impulse, knowing that even a glance could trigger consequences beyond comprehension. I thought of past operators, and the whispered tales of those who hadn't respected the rule, of tools lost and minds fraying, of moments where someone just had to see. Each anecdote had seemed distant before, almost like exaggeration, but now the stories had clarity, and fear was irrelevant to the precision demanded by compliance. My own reflection in the console seemed to lean forward, despite my posture, drawn to the black water as if understanding the danger I wasn't allowed to confront. I reminded myself that Rule 11 wasn't a suggestion or a guideline. It was a boundary enforced not by law or logic, but by forces I could barely perceive. The hook swayed minutely, a slow arc that created deceptive shadows across the waterline. The rhythm of movement, combined with the absence of sound from below, amplified a sense of being observed. I could feel it, not as eyes but as a pressure in the air, in the vibrations of the rig, an awareness that didn't belong to me. Every muscle tensed, every breath measured, every nerve alert. The act of looking directly, even momentarily, would cross a threshold I could not uncross. I focused on the instruments, the lights, anything but the water, willing myself to obey, despite the tension tearing at my attention. Minutes stretched like hours, the pendulum of the hook, reflecting my own inner struggle with restraint. My mind conjured scenarios of what might exist beneath, impossible forms and shapes that I could neither confirm nor deny. The anticipation was exhausting. My eyes threatened to drift toward the water despite my discipline. Every flicker of reflection felt amplified, every ripple a potential threat. I realized that the rule existed not only to prevent harm, but to train perception itself, forcing the mind to survive under uncertainty, under potential horror, under an awareness of forces beyond comprehension. The deck continued its routine, crew members moving obliviously, unaware of the cognitive strain I bore alone. I felt both relieved and isolated, my attention completely consumed by the suspended hook and the invisible weight of the rule. Every vibration, every subtle shift of light, every flicker of reflection reminded me that observing too much, even indirectly, could be dangerous. I leaned back slightly, trying to ground myself in the mechanical reality of the crane and console, but the shadows in my peripheral vision seemed to stretch, as if testing the limits of my obedience. The night pressed in, unbroken with only the hum of machinery, the gentle sway of the hook, and the distant murmur of the rig as constants. My eyes remained fixed on the instruments, every nerve on edge, acutely aware of the rule and its invisible enforcer. The water beneath, black and infinite, seemed almost to pulse, to breathe, as if it remembered every operator who had looked too long or acted too quickly. I realized with a mix of terror and relief that Rule 11 was less about visibility and more about acknowledging limits, boundaries beyond which knowledge itself could be dangerous. As the hook completed its final swing of the cycle, resting just above the waterline, I felt the strain in my body ease marginally, though my mind remained alert. Nothing emerged from the depths, nothing shifted, and yet I understood that the lesson of restraint was permanent. I exhaled slowly, letting tension seep from my shoulders, recognizing that surviving all 11 rules required vigilance, obedience, and a respect for things I could neither see nor name. Something in the stillness suggested the night was not yet finished with me, and I stayed fixed to the console, every sense stretched taut, waiting. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.